Thanks for watching this AI Weekly Update from Henry AI Labs. This weekly update will start off by covering this blog post describing the text-to-text transfer transformer, the T5 model, trained on this colossal clean-crawled corpus, about 750 gigabytes of text, and it's in this text-to-text framework. This text-to-text framework is what's super interesting about this paper, learning how you can perform all these tasks with a single language model by simply structuring the input representation with the task, like translate English to German, as all the signal you need to perform this translation task, compared to a task like natural language inference, where you just give it an input to tell it what task you want to perform. This paper performs a very large-scale study on different model architectures, pre-training objectives, different factors of constructing these data sets, and how this impacts the downstream performance of this text-to-text transfer transformer model. In the blog post, they give a demonstration of the question answering capability, offering a trivia game that you can play if you want to compete against this kind of model. And then you can also see the results in fill-in-the-blank text generation, where again, they use this text-to-text format. All they do is they say, I'd like to eat peanut butter, and underscore and the number of words you want to fill in with, and then sandwiches. And you can see the different results that are produced by having this kind of input-output text-to-text format in the T5 model. Then we'll look at this great survey paper, A Primer in BERTology, looking at a ton of different papers that try to explain how the BERT model works, the difference between BERT embeddings and other previous techniques for natural language processing and word embeddings, things like what kind of knowledge like syntactic and word knowledge is represented in BERT models, and other things like trying to visualize the self-attention layers and what they're looking at, and other pre-training objectives, how big should these models be, and all sorts of research in the space of advancing these BERT language models. BERT Can See Out of the Box is a really interesting paper exploring how well BERT trained only on text can attend to visual embeddings that come from a pre-trained faster RCNN model trained on the visual genome dataset. So in this paper, they just add these visual representations to the segment A part of the BERT input representation and show that this model, with very little fine-tuning, can perform visual question generation. We'll also look at a really interesting new advancement in training question answering models from synthetic data, similar to a recent paper covered in AI Weekly Update, where an author used the GPT-2 model to generate potential Reddit comments and then filter these Reddit comments with the BERT model. This has a similar pipeline of using GPT-2 to generate questions and using BERT to filter those questions. This interaction between BERT and GPT-2 to generate these artificial question answering pairs to augment datasets is used to advance the state-of-the-art in Squad 2.0, these different natural language processing question answering tasks. Also this week in AI, Salesforce released a really interesting blog post describing their paper Learning to Retrieve Reasoning Paths from the Wikipedia Graph, constructing these graphs based on the hyperlinks between Wikipedia paragraphs in order to have this recurrent neural network that learns how to traverse the graph to gather the information it needs to answer these multi-hop questions that require traversing these graphs in order to get all the information you need to answer these complex questions. Learning to Continually Learn is a really interesting meta-learning paper that tasks the outer loop with having the inner loop not forget these sequentially learned tasks, as in the common catastrophic forgetting problem in machine learning, where a model learns to perform well at task A, then is trained on task B, and has completely forgotten task A. In this paper, they avoid manual approaches like generative replay or having this elastic weight consolidation or sparse activations being manually enforced, and rather they use the meta-learning outer loop inner loop controller to directly optimize to avoid catastrophic forgetting and learn 600 sequential classification problems. Another interesting paper that came out this week is Rewriting History with Inverse Reinforcement Learning. This paper is looking at how you can relabel past trajectories based on this idea of inverse reinforcement learning, which is where you're predicting the goal given the trajectory rather than producing a trajectory given some goal. In this paper, they're going to use this technique in order to improve on sample-efficient multitask reinforcement learning, such as doing different tasks like sweep block into drawer, lift block, or push green button, and having all this different experience that you want to share across tasks that they're going to do with inverse reinforcement learning. Google has released two really interesting datasets for vision language representation learning. The first is extensions to the OpenImages version 6 dataset, now featuring localized narratives. This idea of localized narratives is to describe the image while simultaneously tracing over the image with the mouse as you're describing it. So you have this kind of a vision language information, otherwise known as language grounding, by having the mouse as it's scrolling through the image with respect to describing the image with the text information. Also in the space of vision language information and language grounding, Google's released this Street View Panorama dataset that has this Street View Panorama and then natural language instructions like orient yourself so that the umbrellas are to the right in order to navigate this world with the language instructions. It's a really interesting data set and really cool to see this vision language information combined in this way. Another interesting paper that came out this week is Batch Normalization Biases Deep Residual Networks Towards Shallow Paths from DeepMind, exploring the impact of batch normalization on training these deep neural networks and showing that they really behave like an ensemble of shallow networks and how to improve on this with the new skip init initialization technique proposed in this paper and a simpler normalization layer by just having this alpha parameter rather than the batch normalization layer. Another interesting blog post is transformers are graph neural networks, showing how transformers are really just graph neural networks that treat sentences, paragraphs, input sequences as fully connected word graphs. Following in the line of popular blog posts like the Illustrated Transformer or the Illustrated GPT-2 is the Illustrated Self-Supervised Learning. This blog post gives different visualizations of these self-supervised learning tasks like image colorization, image super resolution, or image inpainting, in which we construct these supervised learning tasks from unsupervised or unlabeled data in this self-supervised learning framework. Freeze Discriminator is another interesting paper that came out this week that shows that with transfer learning in GANs, where say you want to train a GAN on ImageNet and then transfer it into a smaller dataset, that simply separating the discriminator into a feature extractor and a classification head and freezing the weights of the feature extractor part of the discriminator is a strong baseline for doing this transfer learning with GANs. Facebook published a blog post about how their fast MRI competition resulted in this banding artifact in the fast MRI images. Their solution to overcome these banding artifacts is to use adversarial training such that if it produces these banding artifacts, it'll get a high loss from the adversary. A really interesting technique to improve on this MRI reconstruction in their fast MRI challenge. Facebook also published a really interesting blog post on turning any two-dimensional photo into a three-dimensional image by using this prediction of the depth map from this labeled dataset. So they describe how they're able to convert these two-dimensional images into three-dimensional by using the depth maps and how they predict this on mobile devices by using the neural building blocks of the FBNet blocks in the UNet cell architecture, and then how they use this ChamNet quantization aware training such that it can be deployed on phones that can use any kind of camera to construct these depth maps and produce these kinds of images. We'll end this AI Weekly Update by going through the NLP newsletter from Elvis at Dare.ai that goes through different papers and different blog posts that came out this week in deep learning and artificial intelligence. This week, Google AI released a blog post about their text-to-text transfer transformer named the T5 model. This is interesting because they've scaled it up to a very big data set. This colossal clean crawled corpus C4 is about 750 gigabytes. For the sake of reference, GPT-2 is trained on this Reddit filtered web text dataset that's about 40 gigabytes. So it's almost 20 times the size of the dataset that GPT-2 is trained on. But the text-to-text transfer transformer, one of the most interesting details about it is the text-to-text input-output format. So what they do is, in order to have the same model perform different tasks, they just seed it with the natural language of the task they want the model to perform. So translate English to German goes in as an input, and then that is good, and it translates it. And then when it wants to do something like entailment or like natural language inference or text classification, it does it by just seeding it with this natural language and then colon to give it the instruction on what task it's supposed to perform. So this is a unique way of doing these large language models that are performing multiple tasks. Usually when you have, say, the BERT model, you adapt it to different tasks by slicing out that CLS token or all sorts of different ways of adapting it to different tasks. So this text-to-text framework is a novel contribution of this paper. Also in this paper, they test a ton of different ways of training these models. They have this large ablation over different architecture choices, different objectives, all sorts of different things in a 53-page paper describing their experiments. In the blog post, they discuss the question answering capabilities of a model like this and how it has sort of memorized these answers in the parameters of the T5 model. So it asks questions like, when was Franklin D. Roosevelt born? And it's able to say 1882 based on the weights of the parameters. You can see a demo of the kind of questions it can answer and play with it in this T5 trivia game, and you can let's play and play trivia against the T5 model. Also in the blog post is a demonstration of how well it can fill in the blank. So the way that they do this is they seed it with I love peanut butter and underscore and then the number of words to fill in the middle of the sentence, and then it writes these long paragraphs or sentences to fill in the blanks. A really interesting model, probably the state of the art in natural language processing on probably the most tasks. Also this week in AI, a really great survey on BERTology came out. BERTology describes all these different research papers that are looking to explore the BERT model, whether it's to modify the architecture or extend different details of it like the Roberta extension or XLNet, or if it's to see what kind of language is contained in BERT, like the use of the embeddings in BERT or the knowledge contained in it like syntactic, semantic, or world knowledge. So they start off the survey by describing different studies on the embeddings learned by BERT, showing a study that says that the distributional hypothesis of these word representations holds, another study showing that the representations of the same word varies depending on the position of the sentence So you know how the BERT model has the sentence A and then the sentence B. They find that the representations of the words or the embeddings are different depending on whether it appears in sentence A or sentence B. So this shows different studies. This is a survey paper covering a ton of different papers, studying all sorts of different areas, studying the attention patterns in the BERT model, how it attends to different positions with respect to the density that's applied when you do that query key multiplication, then it goes through that softmax multiplication. You can see the density of how those weights are applied in these kind of attention pattern visualizations. The survey paper goes on to describe all sorts of things like how the different strategies for training BERT, things like removing next sentence prediction, different masking techniques, all sorts of different areas in which the BERT model is being explored to see how to get better performance out of it, and to see how you can adapt it to things like multilingual BERT. Something I've been really interested lately is these multimodal BERT models, things like image text BERT, like the image BERT or VilBERT, or the code BERT that combines natural language and programming language. It's a really interesting survey, something that I'm really excited to study myself and learn more about this BERTology area of research. Another interesting paper that came out in AI this week is BERT Can See Out of the Box on the cross-modal transferability of text representations. So they say that their research is inspired by these monolingual BERT models that can be competitive in zero-shot cross-lingual settings. So monolingual BERT describing these BERT models that are trained on, say, mass language modeling and next sentence prediction on this massive English text corpora, and then transferred into something like an English to French task or some different thing of a different language that combines the English information, generally exploring sort of the generalizations of the abstractions learned with these attention layers. So the question of the research study is, does BERT contain abstractions that generalize beyond text? And it's looking to see how well you can adapt these visual tokens with the text embeddings and how much fine-tuning really needs to happen. So the model is they directly take 36 regions of interest from a faster RCNN model trained on visual genome, and they take these regions of interest and embed them with a linear projection layer from something like a 2,304 dimension vector down into 768 dimensions to align with the input to the BERT model. So they show that they don't need too much fine tuning with respect to adding these image tokens for the task of visual question generation. So the research study is exploring, giving these images and a text description, how well this model can learn to ask questions about the image. So it's definitely an interesting kind of task, this visual question generation. This image is showing sort of a description of what the model is looking at, visualizing these attention layers and seeing what kind of areas of the image they're looking at or what areas of the text description when they're generating different questions. Salesforce's research blog published a really interesting article about their paper to solve multi-hop question answering. Multi-hop question answering describes problems in which you have a question like, when was the football club founded in which Walter Otto Davis played at center forward? In order to answer this question, first you have to traverse this paragraph about Walter Davis in order to find out what football club he played for in the first place, and then you have to go to the football club page to find out when that football club was founded. So this is kind of a problem where you have to go find some information that takes you to another set of information in order to answer the original question. Describes this overall problem of multi-hop question answering, or maybe it's also described as open domain question answering, where you have a massive amount of data, like the entire Wikipedia corpus or the entire internet, and you're trying to find an answer to a question that might have multiple levels of reasoning that you need to do to find the answer. So the solution in the Salesforce paper is to construct Wikipedia graphs based on the hyperlinks between articles. So in Wikipedia, they have these like links to other Wikipedia pages within each paragraph that forms this graph. So say this is an article about the NBA. This might be a link to LeBron James or the founder of basketball or something like that. And that's how they form these graphs of Wikipedia to do these reasoning paths. So the idea is that they have this recurrent neural network that takes in the initial state, which is probably just a TF-IDF, most similar article with respect to the query, and then it learns to take the hidden state and choose which edge it wants to traverse in the Wikipedia graph in order to aggregate all the information it needs in order to perform this kind of extractive question answering system. It's a really interesting model. This reasoning path is something that I expect to have an enormous impact, and it's definitely something I'm excited to study about this multi-hop question answering problem. Transformers or graph neural networks is a really interesting blog post connecting transformer language models or transformer models for any kind of problem with graph neural networks like the graph attention model or the graph convolutional network. So we'll start off describing this by looking at this idea of treating sentences as fully connected word graphs. So in transformers, we treat every word as if it's connected to every other word. And this is how you would describe these sentences or these sequences of text as a graph in this kind of a data structure. So in graph neural networks, they're looking at these graphs that are sparsely connected, meaning that they're not connected to every node in the graph, as the transformer would treat the words in a sentence or any kind of sequence of text inputted to the transformer. So in the graph neural networks, they learn these message passing networks that basically deciding how much information flows along the edges. And it's this weighted sum of contribution of the information from each of the edges that relates the transformer with these graph neural networks. The transformer is learning how much to weight the edges of each of the words in a similar way that, say, a social network graph or a citation network graph learns to weight the edges of its neighbors as well. Training question answering models from synthetic data is a really interesting paper on using this artificially generated question answering data pairs for data augmentation for question answering models useful for benchmarks like Squad 1.1 or Squad 2.0. These are some examples of generated questions from different GPT-2 models with different counts of parameters. You see this text as description. Albert Einstein is known for his theories, all the way to primarily through his theoretical studies of the photon. And you see the different questions that come out of the different models, and more specific and better questions for training these models comes out of the higher parameter GPT-2 model. And you see the comparison with the questions that the human or that a human asks after reading this text. So this is the pipeline that they use in their paper for generating these questions. You start off with a given paragraph, and then you sample answer candidates using a BERT model. Then you, from these answer candidates, the BERT basically slices out these start-end positions in a paragraph in order to pass it in as input into the GPT-2 model. So given these potential answers, the GPT-2 model is going to look for questions. The GPT-2 model is just going to produce a ton of these potential questions, and then the BERT model is going to filter these potential questions using this round-trip consistency method to format this synthetic question-answer dataset to supplement the original dataset. This table shows the results of appending these extra questions onto the original dataset and training a BERT model on question answering on the Squad 2.0 dataset. And this improvement is also interesting because the Squad 2.0 dataset also contains unanswerable questions, which doesn't come as a result of this data augmentation technique. So it's definitely interesting to see the gains achieved by adding these questions using this strategy. This week in AI, another great paper from the research lab that brought the POET algorithm and is exploring these AI generating algorithms described by Jeff Clune about having these algorithms that can meta-learn architectures, meta-learn the tasks themselves in all sorts of different ways. So in this paper, they're looking at learning to continually learn. So this paper is really well described in this video from Jeff Clune that goes over the overview of this paper. It's really awesome. So it starts off with a description of catastrophic forgetting. So I first became familiar with catastrophic forgetting when I was studying GANs and this problem with the discriminator, where as the generator is training the distribution of the data it's generating, the discriminator is going to forget to classify the previous data sets that the generator was producing. And as a result, the generator is going to cycle back into that kind of data, and it's going to cycle because of catastrophic forgetting. But catastrophic forgetting is generally describing this problem where if you train a machine learning model on one task, like say it's CFAR 10 and it's dog versus cat binary classification, then you train that model the same parameters on dog versus horse or something totally different like ship versus truck, it's going to completely forget how to do the original task of dog versus cat. So this is a problem with catastrophic forgetting. It learns task A, then learns task B, and it's forgotten how to do task A in the process. This is the Achilles heel of machine learning as described by Jeff Clune. So in the talk, he describes some of the manual solutions that have come up with to combat catastrophic forgetting. Some of these techniques are rehearsal techniques where you save a subset of the data. So say as I'm training my new model on truck versus ship, I save some data from that cat versus dog, and every, say, 5 epochs of truck versus ship, I train 2 epochs on dog versus cat, so the model remembers that task. And there are all sorts of other ways of doing this. Things like elastic weight consolidation, which is where you use this Fisher information matrix to try to see which parameters are the most essential to certain tasks and which ones you should update when you're fine-tuning it to a new task. Things like sparse representations and all sorts of different techniques that have come out to combat this kind of catastrophic forgetting problem. This paper, Learning to Continually Learn, is one of these AI generating algorithms that are meta-learning the learning algorithms themselves. So the idea is instead of employing these manual solutions like experience replay or enforcing sparse activations or some kind of thing like elastic weight consolidation, they're going to meta-learn the learning algorithm itself. So the outer loop is optimizing this inner loop of don't forget tasks as they're sequentially learned. So one of the key insights in their study is about how traditional neural modulation tries to alter the plasticity of the weights on the backward pass, but they instead do this directly modifying the activations in the forward pass by having these two separate networks, one which gates the neural network that's going to perform the classification task, and then the one that performs the classification task. So they show how this gating indirectly affects the backward pass with the updates to the parameters, and how this results in a better architecture for this kind of meta-learning algorithm. This is a paper that I'm still really trying to digest and get a great sense of and maybe make a video summary of, but this paper, Learning to Continually Learn, another really awesome paper in the space of AI generating algorithms and meta-learning. If you're interested in learning more about meta-learning and multitask learning, a really great course just came out from Stanford, CS 330 Multitask and Meta-Learning, containing this playlist of about 12 lectures covering different areas of meta-learning and multitask learning. An interesting paper that came out with respect to multitask learning with these reinforcement learning robotic control systems is Rewriting History with Inverse RL, Hindsight Inference from Policy Improvement. So this technique is describing ideas of how they can be sample efficient with respect to the experience that they collect across different tasks. This idea of inverse reinforcement learning is to take a trajectory or a set of data, remembering that these reinforcement learning data sets contain this sequence of state action, state action, state action until the final, the sequence is terminated with a reward or what have you. So you take a trajectory, and with inverse reinforcement learning, you can try to predict the goal or what the model or the agent was trying to achieve when it produced that trajectory. And they do this in order to relabel these trajectories for the sake of being more data efficient. So things like when it's performing this task, it's going to label it as lift block, sweep block into drawer, or push green button. This is kind of the idea behind this multitask reinforcement learning system that's performing these different control tasks. This week in AI, Google has published two massive data sets for vision language tasks like grounded language navigation and this kind of street view panorama data set, and localized narratives in the Open Images v6 release. So Open Images is a massive data set, 9 million images, annotated with 36 million image level labels, 15.8 million bounding boxes, 2.8 million instance segmentations, and 391,000 visual relationships. So visual relationships describes labeling this as the green bounding box of person, blue bounding box of guitar, and then holds as the visual relationship between the two bounding boxes. It's a really interesting data set, enormous, very useful for these kind of computer vision tasks. So one of the most interesting releases with Open Images v6 is localized narratives. Sort of similar to how I'm moving around my mouse as I describe this blog post is the idea of localized narratives. So they have this caption of the image, and they're going to be moving around the mouse as they describe the image. So in the front portion of the picture, we can see a dried grass area with dried twigs. There is a woman standing wearing light blue jeans, blah, blah, blah. So you get the idea of using the trace of the mouse as vision information that corresponds with the language caption to get more information and more labeled data for vision language tasks. The other interesting data set is this street view panorama language grounding task. This is really cool. You have this street view, and you have directions in language like orient yourself so that the umbrellas are to the right, go straight and take a right at the first intersection. It's really cool to think of being able to control these like Google Maps, Google Earth visualizations with natural language instructions. You see another example of two parked bicycles and a discarded couch on the left. Walk just past this couch and stop before you pass another parked bicycle. So learning how to navigate these kind of visual worlds with natural language instructions is something that I think is really cool and interesting. Following the theme of popular blog posts like the Illustrated Transformer or the Illustrated GPT-2 is the Illustrated Self-Supervised Learning. This blog post shows illustrations of what self-supervised learning is. So it starts off with an example of image colorization, where you take images and you construct a self-supervised learning task by converting them into grayscale and having the network predict the corresponding RGB image from the grayscale counterpart. The blog post then shows super resolution and how you can automatically construct the supervised learning task from unlabeled data by downsampling images to say 64 by 64 resolution and then predicting the higher resolution counterpart like 256 by 256 or something higher than that. The blog post further describes image in-painting, which is where you're predicting the missing region, different areas like the jigsaw puzzle, the context prediction, predicting the geometric transformation. So say you rotate the image and then predicting how many degrees it was rotated, or you could also do something like translating it, shifting it, scaling it, all sorts of different geometric transformations. You can do these images, and then the self-supervised learning task is to predict how the image was transformed. This blog post describes different techniques, giving visual examples to provide more information about what self-supervised learning is and how you can use it to automatically get these labels from unlabeled data on vision datasets like videos or just large image datasets. This week in AI, a new paper from DeepMind came out that's exploring how batch normalization behaves in these deep residual neural networks. So they show that normalized residual neural networks behave like an ensemble of shallow networks, showing the effect that this normalization of batch norm has on the weights and the way that they share weights in this network. So in this paper, they propose this new skip init initialization technique that allows you to train these deep res nets without batch normalization, simply using this alpha scalar parameter to alter the way that you normalize these layers. So it's a really interesting paper, important to have more understanding of these normalization layers used to train deep neural networks. Facebook AI has been doing some really cool work in 3D deep learning. This latest blog post is describing how they're turning any two-dimensional photo into a three-dimensional photo by predicting the depth map. So they have this data set of 3D images and there are corresponding depth maps, and they're learning the mapping from regular two-dimensional images taken with any old camera that doesn't have this RGB-D sensor, and how they can map into the corresponding depth map by using this UNet style architecture. So the UNet style architecture, it has the UNet architecture, but then it uses these FBnet hardware efficient blocks in order to process the image. So the image goes through these different blocks in the UNet style to construct this network. And they also described the paper ChamNet, which is how they optimize this model for mobile deployment, things like quantization aware training that makes this easier to just put into a phone compared to having it run on some big server or something like that with the compute requirements. Facebook's AI blog also published about additional advancements in their fast MRI reconstruction challenge to try to quickly construct these MRI images. But a lot of the result of this competition has these banding artifacts. They usually arrive in these generator networks that are based on these convolutional networks or what have you. Things like how the StyleGAN 2 is addressing these water droplet artifacts or sort of the centering of certain features. This blog post is looking at how they can combat these artifacts in the fast MRI images. So the idea here is to integrate this adversary that's predicting a task that if it does use this banding artifact, it will result in the adversary producing a high loss for the original generator network. So they use this adversary in order to add additional structure to the loss function on the mean squared error to get better images coming out of this fast MRI system. So if you want to learn more about this, you can read their paper about how they're optimizing and getting rid of this banding artifact with adversarial training. In last week's AI Weekly Update, we looked at the DermGAN model, where they use this pix-to-pix, image-to-image translation model, which is based on the Generative Adversarial Network framework, to synthesize new images of these skin cancer or different skin conditions with an image-to-image model that can vary details in the data set, like the skin type, the location of the disease or the patch, and then also the lighting effects of the camera. So that's one example of how generative adversarial networks can be used to create synthetic data for data augmentation in the medical imaging domain. So problems with the medical imaging domain is that they don't have a lot of data. So one solution to overcome this, particularly in the classifiers, is transfer learning. You train a classifier like a ResNet 50 on ImageNet, and then you transfer it over to medical imaging. So this paper, Freeze Discriminator, is looking at how you can apply transfer learning to generative adversarial networks. So say you want to generate these skin condition images and you don't have a lot of data, you might try transferring from ImageNet, from a GAN trained on ImageNet, into a GAN to produce these skin condition images. So the idea behind Freeze Discriminator is showing that in a similar way that you might freeze the lower layers of a image classifier and then fine tune the later layers that are referred to as sort of the feature extractor and then the classification layers, is a similar idea to how you would transfer from the discriminator trained on ImageNet into the discriminator trained on like medical imaging problems. So describe the results of their study showing the advancement in the freeze discriminator compared to just fine-tuning the model. They describe a lot of previous techniques for doing transfer learning with GANs, and then they show the results of transferring from StyleGAN on these faces into cats and dogs. Elvis at Dare/AI has published a really great deep learning and natural language processing newsletter covering different areas and papers that have come out this week in the field. The newsletter starts off by discussing this primer and birdology paper that we looked at earlier in this AI Weekly Update video, discussing these different areas of studying how the BERT model works and how it can be improved. The blog post then discussed the limits of transfer learning with the unified text-to-text transformer, this T5 model that's looking to have this text-to-text format, experimenting with all these different dimensions of these massive transformer models with an enormous data set, this colossal clean-crawled corpus, to perform all these different natural language processing tasks. They also describe the 12-in-1 multitask vision and language representation learning as learning to have a better system of learning these vision language models that can do tasks like visual question answering, visual question generation, or language grounding like the Street View Panorama dataset recently released by Google. The blog post then describes this paper BERT can see out of the box on the cross-modal transferability of text representations, a paper that I thought was really interesting, showing that you can easily transfer the vision features from a faster RCNN model into a pre-trained BERT model trained only on text. It discusses the next decade in AI, a recent paper from Gary Marcus looking at techniques to build more robust AI systems that do better on tasks like reasoning tasks and these other kind of things. Then 10 breakthrough technologies in 2020, a list from MIT Tech Review, and Time to Rethink the Publication Process in Machine Learning, a blog post from Yoshua Bengio about the current publication system and problems with it that need to be solved. It also discusses different tools and datasets, the Allen NLP, which is this library used. It's also associated with their web demo of these different models, like the Rover model is on the Allen NLP demo on their website. And they discuss this new implementation of the pointer generator network, and then other things like PyTorch Lightning, graph neural networks, and TensorFlow 2, this small BERTA model, a tiny model to train on a tight data set, and things like ethics in AI, different articles and blog posts. I really like this article, a deep dive into the Reformer, that has all these nice animations showing how the locality sensitive hashing, the reversible ResNets and difference between that and gradient checkpoint, and a lot of these other ideas in the Reformer. Then other articles, the transformers of graph neural networks is something that we looked at in this video. I thought was really interesting, connecting these two different kinds of models by just looking at the transformers as treating these text, paragraphs, and sentences as fully connected graphs. The newsletter then discusses education resources like the open sourcing of the Stanford CS330, deep multitask and meta learning on YouTube, PyTorch notebooks from Dare.ai as well, the draft of the Fast AI book, and then other things that will help you learn more about deep learning and artificial intelligence. Also really grateful for including my video on the automatic shortcut removal with the lens filter in the noteworthy mentions. Really cool. So I really recommend reading this blog post, this newsletter. It's something that I've been using to keep up with deep learning and NLP myself.